Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Tim and I are going to change gears with you a little bit and go from methodologies and concepts and modeling down to the site level and talk about how one might really apply these carbon projects at a local level and try to give a sense of what the value of the benefits are from this kind of project and what the feasibility of actually bringing those credits to market and selling them would be for a specific project. In terms of the structure of what we're going to do, Tim is going to provide an overview of the Herring River Restoration Project out in Wellfleet, which is the example we're using to illustrate these carbon concepts. And I'm going to talk a little bit, it's kind of a diversion, talk about the social cost of carbon. We heard that mentioned this morning, but it's kind of a key concept underlying the benefits assessment here. And given that I think we've now dropped down to 1.5% economists in the room, it's probably worth a little bit of explanation. I'm going to then talk about the methane benefits at Herring River and really try to use an approach that shows you the kinds of calculations that you need to do to actually implement something like this. And it's not rocket science. It's not what Omar's done. It's relatively straightforward and I think gives a good sense of what's the scale of the methane benefit. I'm then going to talk about the methane credits on the market and get into the issue of transaction costs. That was also mentioned this morning. You have to package your credits. You have to do various studies to support selling them. And I'll look at the costs of doing that, look at what you can sell them for, and look at sort of the net return. And also get into some issues about how big does your project have to be in order to justify trying to sell credits. So that's kind of the overview of the talk. Just a few things. The focus here is really going to be on avoiding methane from tidal restoration or as a result of tidal restoration projects. Soil carbon is obviously important and above ground vegetation, but we're not going to be looking at those in this case study. Ultimately, you would have to take all those compartments into account as you evaluate your project. But we thought methane is probably the largest benefit category. It's likely to dominate these other ones, and that's what we focused on initially. Over the longer run, as more money becomes available, we're interested in looking at these other carbon pools. But this is really a methane avoidance case study. So let me turn it over to Tim, and then I'll be back to talk about the social costs.
Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for sticking it out here toward the end. I'm going to just spend a very brief time going over a very simplistic overview of the Herring River project. It's much more complicated than I'm showing here, that we're getting into here. Okay, so the Herring River is out in Wellfleet, the other end of Cape Cod from Wacoya Bay, part of Cape Cod National Seashore. Here's the project area in a coastal survey map from the 1880s. And the important thing to take here from the Herring River is, at that point in time, two inlets to Wellfleet Harbor and Cape Cod Bay at these areas called Jaquezet Neck down in the bottom part of the map, and up on the left, an area called Duck Harbor. Here's a site today, a current map, and these areas have both filled in the case of the Duck Harbor opening, and in the case of the Jaquezet Neck opening has been closed off with a dike. The Duck Harbor entrance was shoaled in naturally over time. The other inlet was closed off by this dike. This is the Jaquezet Neck dike, built in about 1909 with the expressed purpose of draining the system for mosquito control and other ancillary benefits, agriculture and things like that, which never really took hold. The dike here was reconstructed in the mid-70s. It includes 3 6-foot wide culverts. 2 of the culverts have conventional flapper valves which block incoming tidal flow. 1 culvert has a partially open sluice gate that allows very limited tidal flow, about a 1.5 or 2 foot tide range on the riverside compared to about a 10-foot tide range downstream. This is just a very, again, oversimplified list of some of the issues that the Herring River contends with. A former 1,000-acre salt marsh and estuary intertidal area is limited now to about 70 acres. Large areas of former salt marsh have subsided, and a whole host of other ecological problems that we're trying to alleviate. The essential element of the project is to reconstruct the dike that's there now with a new structure with much larger openings, and the key here is an adjustable, or a series of adjustable tide gates, and this is a rendering of what the new dike we expect to look like. This has 9 adjustable tidal gates, and the reason for these tide gates is to gradually gradually restore tide range over a fairly long time period, and the reason for this is to address or mitigate a whole host of ecological and socioeconomic uncertainties throughout the floodplains. The idea is that by gradually opening these gates over time, we can monitor the effect, monitor the response of the system, and take any other remedial actions as needed over time. The goal eventually is to get to this condition where the gates are wide open and we have essentially full tidal flow. Let's see. Kate, can you hit the left? So these are 2 animations from a hydrodynamic model that show a comparison of existing penetration of salinity versus a time in the future when those gates are fairly open. So on the left side, we have model results showing salinity penetration. You can see just a little bit of high saline water into the lower reaches of the system. Once those gates are fully open, we expect much greater flow of salt water much higher into the system, closer to the historical condition. All that boils down to these sort of aggregated vegetation changes over time. The map, I know the map is a little hard to read. Don't pay attention to the colors on the maps. The take home is essentially a reversal of the vegetation coverage, where currently now there's about 20 hectares of salt and brackish marsh. When those gates are fully opened and the system comes to some sort of stabilized hydrology, we expect over about 270 hectares of salt marsh and a huge reduction in coverage of both freshwater wetlands and current wooded and shrublands that occur there now. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom.
Okay, so the big picture here is we're looking at a tidal restoration project that will essentially increase the salinity in the Herring River area, which is about 400 and some odd hectares. The concept, and I missed the science talks this morning, but I hope somebody got into this. As you increase salinity, you have the potential to decrease methane emissions significantly. So we've got methane, which has a high global warming potential factor, recently, I guess, identified as high as 35. And the thinking here was, well, doing a wetlands restoration project like this might have a significant impact on methane. It might lead to a large reduction. Methane's a potent greenhouse gas. From an economics perspective, there should be a lot of benefits associated with that. Let's see what they are. Now, the sort of foundation concept here is the social cost of carbon. And I'm guessing, how many people in the room have actually heard of the social cost of carbon and know what it is? Okay, a few, but not everyone by a wide margin. I think it's important for me to talk about this a little bit so you understand where the how do we get to a benefits estimate. The social cost of carbon is a concept that's been developed by an interagency U.S. government group of economists, and the goal was to produce some dollar values that could be associated with emissions of various greenhouse gases that represent the damage resulting from those emissions. And the idea was that these numbers could be used in regulatory cost-benefit analyses to evaluate projects that would have climate benefits. So that group got together. It worked primarily on CO2 initially, and it came up with a stream of potential dollar values associated with reducing CO2 emissions. And what we have here, let's see, if you look down this column that's 3%, it's basically telling you for emissions that happen in each year, what dollar amount they should be valued at. So for example, 2015, 1 ton of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere is estimated to cause $37 of damage over its lifetime in the atmosphere. And that's globally. And the analyses were presented at different discount rates. Discount rates are the way economists look at bringing costs back to the present so that they can be compared with other benefits or costs in the present. So there's a lot of dispute about what discount rate you should use in the economics literature on climate change. The government agency put out a range at a 5% discount rate. You're talking more like $11 per ton. At a 2.5% discount rate, it's $51 per ton. And over the next 40 years or so, that rises to $71. And that's primarily due to the worsening impacts of releases over time. The concept here is that as it gets warmer, an additional ton of carbon released will do more damage. Speaking to the microphone more? Okay. So these numbers really represent per ton of carbon, or in this case CO2 released to the atmosphere, what is the dollar value damage over the lifetime of that carbon in the atmosphere. And if you look, if you think about 1 ton of carbon released every year for 100 years, and you add up that stream of impacts and discount it back to the present, you get about almost $2,100 in damages from that single ton of carbon over that 100-year period expressed in today's dollars. So, those numbers add up pretty quickly when you talk about the millions and millions of tons of carbon we release every year, or CO2 we release every year. Where do these numbers come from? Well, economists have developed a set of models called integrated assessment models, and they involve coupling kind of a simplified climate model that predicts temperature changes based on economic growth in the world economy, and linking that to damage estimates associated with rising temperature, so that you can model out into the future the impacts of releasing a ton of gas in any particular year, and see what impacts that'll have on temperature, how that will be reflected in damage. And the types of damage categories they look at are to things like agriculture, fisheries, vulnerable industries, forestry. I think human health impacts are included in some of these integrated assessment models, and some of them get more sophisticated. But I think one takeaway in general from the damage modeling is that they don't really reflect everything that is going to happen and that we'll probably think is bad as a result of climate change. I don't think they do a particularly good job of estimating things like biodiversity impacts, nor do they do a good job of dealing with the risk of really catastrophic events that might occur. So in general, I tend to look at these social cost of carbon numbers as really being probably lower bounds, conservative numbers in terms of what the damages would be. So that's an important perspective to kind of keep in mind as you work through these kinds of analyses. Initially, this work was done only for CO2, and then some APA analysts ran the models again and came up with some direct estimates for methane. And given the higher global warming potential of methane, the numbers here are much larger than they are for CO2, and you can see that in the 2015 number of over $1,000 per ton versus I think what we had around 37 or 40 before. So there's a big difference here, and we value methane, you know, in terms of a ton causing much more damage. And in this case, before we had a sort of lifetime impact of a couple of $1,000s. Here, a ton of methane reduced every year for 100 years is going to yield about $70,000 in benefits. Okay, so what did we do at Herring River with this social cost of carbon analysis? Ideally, we would have started out with good estimates of methane emissions from the various subhabitats there. We didn't have that. We had to go to the literature to look for values on methane emissions as a function of salinity. And there have been a number of studies of this. They were summarized in an article by a group led by a scientist named Poffenbarger, who I don't know. Kevin pointed this out to us. And essentially what we've done here is we've looked at the different salinity categories. Below 0.5 parts per thousand, 0.5 to 5, 5 to 18, and then above 18. We tried to estimate an average methane emission rate in each of those categories. And what you can see, for example, here is for the freshwater areas, less than half a part per thousand. We had 8 sites in the Poffenbarger study. The average was about 42 grams per meter squared per year of methane. That converts to about 0.4 metric tons per hectare per year. We ended up averaging across the below 5 parts per thousand groups because that's the way we had the data available at Herring River at this point. So ultimately, we're going to use a 0.835 tons per hectare per year value to look at how do methane emissions change in those areas. Similarly, we have categories for the 5 to 18 and for the saline system above 18. So that's a primary input. Important to recognize it's not from Herring River. Our hope is to go out and actually we're beginning to do measurements at Herring River to actually get some site-specific data. So this, I think, can best be considered kind of a screening analysis at this point of, you know, what the benefits might be. All right, here is a table that tells you something about how the habitats are going to change with the restoration. I think the takeaway here is there's quite a bit of wet deciduous forest, wet shrubland. There is freshwater marsh, there's brackish marsh. All of these are going to be changed in some way as a result of the reflooding of this area. And we used this information about acreage and combined it with the information on emission rates to get to an estimate of how are methane emissions going to change as a result of this project. That's what you see in this table, and I think the key things to point out, we have a column of methane emission rates which came off the previous table. We then specify the baseline area in each of the habitats that we thought were likely to generate methane in the baseline situation. So we've got the wet forest, the wet shrub, the freshwater marsh, and the brackish marsh. And then we have the post-project areas of those, in between. We calculated the baseline emissions in each of these environments by taking the emission rate times the hectares, and that gave us a total of 183 tons per year of methane emissions. Did a similar thing post-project, ended up with 63 tons per year of methane emissions. So a total reduction of about 120 tons per year of methane expected to result from this project. I then applied the 100-year benefit from reducing a ton of methane every year for 100 years, multiplied that by the 120, and that actually produces it was a number that was surprising to me. It's almost $8.5 million in benefits, climate change benefits from doing this project up at Herring River over the life of the project. And that's in today's dollars. That is really the avoided social benefits associated with this project. It may not be the, what could be gotten on the market selling these credits, but it's really, I think, our best current estimate of the damage worldwide that would be avoided by reducing methane emissions at Herring River. So, I think this is a critical number for people, even if they don't plan to market any credits from their projects, being able to put this kind of benefit number into their calculations and add it to all the other ecosystem service benefits. It's very important. I mean, this is not a gigantic project. It's a large project for New England, but $8.5 million in benefits is pretty significant. Just to put this in context, if you look at the avoided methane benefit in terms of dollars per hectare per year, works out to about $905 using, I think I used the 2015 damage numbers. Looking at soil sequestration in a wetland in a salt marsh and using a number of about 1.6 tons per hectare per year, you get about $235 in benefits. So, a tidal restoration project has the potential to yield a lot more benefits than the soil sequestration, which we normally think of as, the real benefit from wetlands projects. On the other hand, I also found some data on the Peconic estuary on Long Island, and that looked at general salt marsh habitat ecosystem services, and these are primarily fisheries and bird benefits. And they estimated those at about $1,300 per hectare per year. So, I would say the methane benefits are kind of in the same general range as the habitat benefits for the fish species, for the shellfish, and for the birds. So that gives you some sense of the relative magnitude of these for a wetland. All right, Kate is telling me I need to finish up here, so let me talk a little bit about the marketing of methane credits and what we did here. There are two factors that really drive whether or not a project will find it economically viable to sell their carbon credits. One's the market price they get for those credits. Social costs might be $40. As Steve, I think, was pointing out, the market price might be anywhere from $5 to $15. So there's a big reduction in kind of the revenue side of this calculation that is currently in place. Maybe that'll change over time as we find ways to push the market prices closer to the social cost of carbon. But the reality now is you have to look at what you could really sell those benefits for on the market. The second factor, which I mentioned earlier, is the transaction costs of actually packaging your credits and then proving you actually achieved them. And those transaction costs are potentially significant and probably are a disincentive for smaller restoration projects to actually enter into the carbon markets. What we've done is we've taken a look at various scenarios on the revenue side and on the transaction cost side to see what the net benefits to a project like Herring River might be in dollar terms. And in order to do this, we had to develop some estimates of VCS transaction costs. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I think the point is we tried to lay out each of the steps in the VCS process and put a price tag on it. And those include things you have to do before you get the project underway. And those are relatively fixed in terms of projects like Herring River. You'd have to prepare a site description, you'd have to do monitoring to determine what your baseline situation is. You have to have some third-party validation of your proposal. all that adds up, and I think our best estimate was that could be on the order of $165,000 before you even get to the point of selling your credits. Then, after you essentially get your project approved under VCS, there are a variety of things you have to do, and probably the most expensive ones have to do with how much monitoring do you have to do to prove that you actually achieved the reductions that you predicted when you sold, or when you got approval for selling the credits. That's where, you know, really the modeling comes in. And in this particular kind of mid-range estimate, we've assumed that for your first cycle of actually proving you achieved the credits you thought you were going to achieve, you'd actually have to go out and do some methane chamber monitoring to demonstrate that. But then we assumed that in later phases you could use modeling. If it turns out that you can use modeling for the whole thing, it brings the cost down quite a bit, and that's clearly where we'd like to be headed here. And, you know, I think further development of the model that Omar described may put us in a good place to actually do that. Overall, we're estimating for Herring River that the transaction costs over the 100-year period of the project would come to almost $600,000 in kind of a mid-range scenario. So what we've done is to figure out, okay, how much net return would a project developer get from selling credits after taking account of transaction costs. We looked at 3 scenarios, and those were a high transaction cost scenario, which involved a lot of modeling to prove out your credits, coupled with a relatively low credit value. And the credit value was done in terms of the percentage of the social cost of carbon that you actually received for selling the credits in the market. So in this case, we had 20% as the price that would be paid relative to the social cost of carbon. The estimated value of the credits in that case was $1.7 million, and the transaction costs were $710,000, yielding almost $1 million in benefits in this very conservative scenario. As we move to higher prices for the carbon offsets sold on the market and more optimistic assumptions about transaction costs, this number rises to $2.8 million, and then for the least conservative, in which we're assuming that market prices are 80% of the social cost of carbon, this project would yield about $6.4 million. So, you know, what happens to the price of carbon offsets in the future has a big impact, and also how much we can drive the transaction costs down will matter. But big picture here, even under a very conservative scenario, the Herring River project is going to yield potentially up to, well, it'll yield in the conservative scenario almost $1 million in benefits, and that could rise, you know, significantly higher under less conservative assumptions. Okay, the last thing we looked at was we tried to figure out, given the transaction costs and revenues under these various scenarios, how big would your project have to be to just break even on those, so that your revenues from selling credits are just equal to your transaction costs, kind of giving a minimum project size. And under the very conservative scenario, we said you'd have to be 171 hectares before you started making any money on your credits. Under the less onerous assumptions, a project of 71 hectares, you know, would begin to become profitable. And under the optimistic assumptions, maybe you could drive this down to around 20 hectares in terms of when you would start actually making money from your credits. So, you know, I think part of the message here is the grouping that Steve talked about for smaller projects could be very important, especially in a place like New England where, you know, we have a lot of small projects to do. We don't have that many projects on the scale of Herring River. And, you know, if you could group a bunch of projects and, you know, get up to above 71 hectares, start to be economic to sell your credits. I think I have said most of this at this point. The general considerations, acceptance of the models could have a big impact. So that's why we're continuing to pursue, you know, how do we get a model that can be generally accepted? And aggregation obviously matters. In terms of future directions, I think the big picture here is tidal restoration projects that increase salinity do have potentially significant methane benefits, but we need to really go out and do more monitoring to understand, you know, methane emissions at specific sites. I don't think our data set is big enough to generalize too far at this point. So, you know, we're proposing to try to do additional work on that. And I guess the only message I'd leave folks with is, you know, even though it may not be economical to sell your credits in the market, as you can see from the social cost of carbon analysis, the benefits are potentially significant anyway. And when coupled with all the other benefits from restoring wetlands, you know, it seems like we ought to be doing a lot more of it. Thank you.
Any questions for Tom or Tim? This is where we really try to make a local case study kind of come alive in terms of how we think about these things. So I wonder if anybody had any questions on what was done, what we learned.
Hi, I was just wondering if you're valuing benefits over a 100-year time horizon, and I may have missed it, but are you factoring in effects of sea level rise on marsh function? Is that included in the models that are being used?
That's actually a great question, and you know, we talked about that early on and concluded that for this project, because of the structure that's put up, it actually can control the level of sea level rise over that period. So we didn't think it was a factor, but for other projects, it could be a very significant factor.
So this may have been alluded to, but at first this restoration project didn't have broad support from the community members. There were a lot of uproar about stinky marshes, right, turning fresh water into marsh. But I'm curious if the social cost has been shared with some of those landowners and whether or not that's changed perspective, or if perspectives have changed over time as you've been able to show some of the science and modeling.
This level of analysis hasn't really been presented to the public at all. It's fairly new even to the project team who's working on the project. But the opposition that was out there about the project has sort of died down because of a lot of education that's gone on just about other aspects of the project in recognition of the other benefits and other things that are going to happen, or we hope to happen.
Well, we see here part of the difference between the gas people, the utilities, and the living systems people. The gas people want to do cost-benefit analyses in 20 years, maybe at most extremely stretching out there to 30 or 40 years, and shut down the benefits beyond that. And you're talking 100 years. So I'm hoping you might make some further comments about that.
Well, the length of the project that you assume is always a significant factor, and you know, there's no particular guidance on exactly what the right number is. I think the climate change impacts are very long, and given that fact, you know, it's appropriate that any analysis of costs and benefits has to go out fairly far. That said, at any positive discount rate, once you get out 100 years or so, the benefits start to look very small. So you're effectively ending it at some point in terms of additional increments of benefit that you actually calculate.
And I guess I would add that there are negative, or there are costs associated with gas lines and the build-out of a fossil fuel-based system that if you cut them off at 20 or 30 or 40 years, it's creating a bias to that calculation.
All right, well, thanks, Tom and Tim, very much for that.